Good evening, everyone. I'm Wendy Wilson. I serve as the Vice President of University Relations. I forgot my title for just a minute. Chief of Staff, and extremely honored to have recently been asked to serve as the Director for the Centers of Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Equity here at Albany State University. It is tradition here at Albany State that we recognize, honor, and celebrate the amazing and outstanding legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. This year, despite COVID-19, will be no exception. And so we are elated to have established this Zoom format. We've extended an invitation to an amazing and remarkable social activist who is highly acclaimed and recognized throughout the nation. And I will extend the platform over to our SGA president, Miss Aaliyah Johnson, who will give you a little more information and introduce this evening's speaker. But viewers, thank you so much for joining us again as we celebrate the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. President Aaliyah Johnson, the platform is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into the introduction of our lovely guest today. A Columbia University graduate, Chelsea Miller is a 24-year-old Brooklyn native and leading voice in youth activism. Chelsea is the co-founder of Freedom March NYC, a youth protest and policy group on the front lines, pushing for reform across the nation. She's addressed thousands of people in speaking engagements. That includes Madison Square Garden, Yale University, and most recently, the March on Washington. Her work has been featured in New York Magazine, Forbes, Vogue, CNN, and BET. In 2016, she worked in the Obama White House as one of the youngest interns on criminal justice reform and urban economic opportunity. She is the co-founder and CEO of Women Everywhere Believe Incorporated, a national organization training women and girls of color to be civic and corporate leaders. Her work has been recognized by elected officials and national organizations. Alike in the space of activism and social entrepreneurship, in 2020, Chelsea was named by the city and state of New York 50 most powerful people in Brooklyn. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome Chelsea.
Good evening, everyone. I am so excited to be joining you all, especially on the heels of not only MLK Day, but also our nation's inauguration, which was just yesterday. And so this is a full circle moment in a lot of ways for me, because I remember in 2016, when I was working at the Obama White House during the 2016 elections, and the feeling of, first and foremost, that transition period, but also acknowledging the fact that our country was going to look a lot different. And when we talk about the work of the Obama administration, particularly around criminal justice reform and the work that was taking place in communities of color through the My Brother's Keeper initiative and other really important work, that would look a lot different, right, for the next 4 years. And I don't think any of us was necessarily prepared for what the 4 years after the Obama administration would bring, from the racial injustices, the responses from community leaders and national leaders, to also the fact that we faced a pandemic, right, this past year. And so there was a lot of tumultuous moments that we had to reckon with, and a lot of really difficult realities that I think for our generation in particular, we had to really face, right, head on, and understand that in a lot of ways, this was the defining moment for our generation, and how are we going to show up? And so one of the things that I talk about a lot is the fact that, you know, a lot of folks look back to the legacy and the work of Martin Luther King and say, well, this is what I would have done during the civil rights period. You know, I would have definitely been by Martin Luther King's side, and John Lewis and C.T. Vivian, right, and all of them doing the work, and I would have been a Shirley Chisholm, et cetera, because we learn about these things through our history textbooks as something of the past. And what this year, I think, in a lot of ways has shown us is that the civil rights movement never ended. right? It just continued and took on new forms and ideations and ways of understanding our society and how we can use vehicles ultimately in community to bring folks together to really dismantle the history of racism that we've seen in this country, while also understanding the fact that it doesn't take just one leader. It doesn't just take 1 year of doing the work. It doesn't just take one summer of upheaval and unrest to dismantle over 400 years, right? What it takes, though, is a sustainable commitment to doing the work. What it takes, though, is a nuanced approach to understanding what happens on the front lines, to how that translates to policy work, and also really leveraging all of the tools that exist across sectors to create change. And so I am going to give a little bit of a storyline on how I am here this evening with all of you and what happened this past summer that put me at the forefront of the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly in New York, right? Because there were different things happening all throughout the US. There was things happening in Portland and DC and Atlanta, right? All over. Louisville, which I actually visited this past summer. So specifically with New York, what had happened was that I, like most of you during the pandemic, was at home. I was at home focused on doing programming for small businesses that needed to learn about digital branding during the pandemic, since most of the brick and mortar businesses were now being, forced to use the digital landscape, right, social media marketing, et cetera, as a way to bring in clientele because everything was shutting down. And so I was doing that for some time. I was also running a task force for women and girls of color focused on COVID-19 relief and thinking through what that looks like. And it was late May at the time, right? That's when we saw on our phones what had happened to George Floyd. And like many people, I was in a state of shock, but I also think the shock did not necessarily come from, right, the fact that this is something new to the history of our country. The shock was more so at the fact that we are in a state of emergency within our country. We are in a place in which we not only now have to deal with the realities of a pandemic that is disproportionately killing, right, Black and brown folks, but also the fact that we must also deal with a violent police state that in a time of crisis is inflicting harm, right, on our communities. And so with all of that taking place and all of that processing that happened, I realized that in New York, there was a narrative because of what was happening everywhere else throughout the country, that the focus was on the looting and the rioting, right? We saw over the first few days of the protests that that's what everyone was talking about. The looting, the rioting, the destruction of property. And so when I decided to go out the night of May 30th. That was by the Barclays Center. For any of you who've ever been to New York and Brooklyn in particular and are familiar with the Barclays Center, it's in downtown Brooklyn. It's prime real estate, right, to the city. And so when I got out there, that was the night of May 30th, there were hundreds of police officers, right, just riot gear with their citizens, right? Folks are coming out, they're angry, they're upset, they're frustrated, understandably so. And what we saw on the ground, because I had posted on social media and said, hey, everyone, I'm going to be out here today because I already had relatively somewhat of a following on social media just because of my work that I've done in the past around social activism. I've been doing activism for years. And so when I posted, people were like, okay, well, if Chelsea's going out, I'll go out too, and I'll follow her. And so what ended up happening, mind you, I hadn't been out before. I was just like, I'm going. And of course, everyone was looking at me like I was crazy. And this was the weekend when, folks were saying that the KKK was coming to New York and the rubber bullets and all of this. And so there was this hyper sense of fear that was taking place on the ground. And so I went out that first night, didn't have a megaphone, and I just started chanting. I started leading the crowd. There's videos that exist throughout the internet that honestly, I think anyone looking at it, it doesn't make any sense. Like, I don't know where this spirit and this energy and this tenacity came from. And then there was a moment that night, and this is really, really important because this is what spearheaded ultimately everything else that happened that summer, where there were agitators in the crowd that was trying to break into Barclays Center. Now, I had posted on social media, I had told folks to come out. If you looked into the crowd that night, there were young kids there. There were folks who really didn't know what the purpose of us being out there was for. Of course, aside from being angry, upset, but where are we going, right? What is the message? What do we want people to know about this moment in history? And so as we saw the agitators starting to get folks riled up to break into the center, it was myself and a few other folks on the ground who actually created a chain with our bodies to block the essentially the looting and the rioting that would have happened that night. And a lot of folks have asked, why stop it? And for me, it's because I am a Black woman first and foremost. And so I thought about the fact that there were young Black kids that were there looking for answers on what we should be doing, who at the end of the day, those agitators didn't care whether or not they made it home that night. And so that's why it was my responsibility to make sure that what happened that night was reflective of the message of what we were trying to accomplish with this movement. And so we managed to steer the crowd in the other direction, ended up going to the bridge. That night ended with no NYPD assaults on the protesters. Mind you, NYPD was still blocking us in. There were still vans that were bombarding protesters. There were still all these things that were happening, right? But as far as the massive attack that would have descended if we had broken into the Barclays Center, that did not happen. There was a video, didn't know folks were recording. We have to love the internet these days. The next day, that video went viral. Anderson's Cooper team got a hold of me, and throughout that summer, right, really followed the story of what was happening in New York and the organizing that was taking place there. After that night, which in a lot of ways was disorganized simply because, again, a lot of folks didn't really know who to listen to, they didn't know what was happening. The following day was the 99th anniversary of the burning of Black Wall Street. A friend and I made a flyer, put it on social media, on Instagram, and that flyer took off in the New York activism organizing community space. And that flyer ultimately resulted in the largest nonviolent protest to take place that night in New York. That was May 31st, 2020, to commemorate the 99th anniversary. And we marched from Washington Square Park to the police precinct, demanding the release of protesters from the week before who had been unlawfully detained and actually didn't have their rights that were being exercised at the time of their arrest. So since that moment of May 31st, I was on the front lines all of this past summer. I have had the honor of working with some of the most incredible Black women leaders, the most incredible trans leaders, the most incredible activists and organizers, families who have been impacted by police violence. I actually was one of the organizers that led the George Floyd memorial that took place in New York because his brother, Terrence Floyd, actually came to New York for his memorial because Terrence Floyd, I believe, is from Brooklyn. And so that, and there's footage of it, I'll share all of this with you all after the talk, of thousands of people leaving Cabin Plaza, going across Brooklyn Bridge. And that was one of the largest protests to take place after the death of George Floyd in New York. And And then after that, speaking at the March on Washington, being one of the youth voices to give truth to power in that space. And when we talk about the legacy of Martin Luther King, we know that the March on Washington was something that took place as a way. What a lot of people don't know was actually one of the biggest things with March on Washington was actually, again, state-sanctioned violence and police brutality. That was one of the things they were asking for, as well as jobs. And so here we are, right, over 50 years later, still in a lot of ways demanding those same things, but also making sure that those demands are in alignment with where we are right now as a country and addressing all of the nuances of what that looks like in the midst, again, of a pandemic. So that is my story of being in the movement. Freedom March NYC was birthed after May 31st, that night when we posted the flyer, and we've organized dozens of protests. We've worked with New York State legislature on creating the development of a New York Youth Commission bill that will actually be introduced this year. We've been working on qualified immunity in New York. We've worked on the development of getting cops out of classrooms and what does that look like within our schools, because we know that the school to prison pipeline is something that disproportionately impacts Black and brown kids. And particularly in New York, what does it look like to really deconstruct that and think about, ways of having more social workers in schools and less police officers? And what does it look like to really invest in our youth, who are the future, and not just the future, but the present, and equip them with the tools they need to really advance and understand, right, the world that we live in, and become leaders. And I think that one of the most powerful things that we've seen, and I'll tie this in even recently with yesterday's inauguration, for those of you who saw Amanda Gorman's poem, what is one of the most powerful things about that is she speaks about being the descendant, right, of slaves and being raised by a single mother, and the fact that in her voice there was power. And when I see Amanda, who I actually know from teenage years, it reminds me of the importance of investing, right, in our kids through the arts, and the importance of investing in what is labeled inner city schools, and being able to give the platforms and the opportunities and the access, right, to the tables that oftentimes we are denied. And so the work continues, and it continues to show up, and it continues to manifest. And so the question of activism and what that looks like for me has taken on so many shapes, facets, and forms, from understanding and deconstructing Black joy and why that's important to our liberation. When you talk about the history of slavery and the ways in which we have used joy as a form of resistance, whether that be through hymns, right, that would be sung, or languages that would be coded as a way to take away from the realities of being on the field and the slave masters and the different ways of play that we created through our culture. I think that's a beautiful thing. And so throughout this summer and leading into 2021, one of the things that we did at Freedom March NYC was really think about, how do we emphasize joy? How do we incorporate that into our organization? Another really important thing we're talking about is this idea around Black women on the front lines. And this is a question that I get a lot across so many different media platforms. I get asked this, and the question is, what does it feel like being a Black woman on the front lines? What does it look like being a Black woman leading in the Black Lives Matter movement? And the response is the same. It feels like history, because the truth is Black women have always been at the forefront. Whether or not we have been recognized is a different story altogether, and whether or not we have gotten credited for the work that we have done is something altogether. But we do know that Black women have always been the engineers of so much that has moved within our society. You can't talk about MLK without talking about Coretta Scott King. And so I think that that is a testament. You can't talk about the fact that, Kamala Harris, the first VP, without talking about Shirley Chisholm, who trailblazed and actually was the first Black woman to run for president. And so we have always been here, and we're not going anywhere. And so I think that when we talk about social activism, it's important to, one, first and foremost, recognize the fact that social activism takes so many different forms. To be an activist is really just to care about what's happening in your community and having an intentionality about the strategies that you will implement to make it better. I don't think that there is a gatekeeper to activism, and I don't think that there should be one, but I do think that everyone should be informed when stepping into this space. And I think that there should be a desire to really be committed to sustainably doing the work. And so that looks different for everyone. That may be going into corporate America and choosing to, champion for, Black folks there. Perhaps it is starting a nonprofit. Perhaps it's being an activist who is on the front lines and works on policy and works on, getting cops out of classrooms, et cetera. I think that everyone has talents and resources and gifts, and it just looks different across the board. So that's important. And then the next thing that I will add is that there is a question about what's next. And I think that when we are talking about what's next, there has to be a very strong belief in the fact that we will win. And the reason why I say this is because a lot of times when we were on the front lines this past summer, this was before the election, this was before even the announcement of Kamala Harris's selection as Biden's VP, this was before all of that, we were saying Trump has got to go. We were saying one term. We were saying you are going to be removed from office. And that was the energy that ultimately led to a complete shift in what happened for this election. And the reason why I say that is because there's actually data that shows that before the George Floyd protests, there was a plateau in voter registration. After the George Floyd protests, voter registration peaked, especially for youth voters. And so when people ask, what is the power of young people? How do young people show up? Are young people even going to show up? Which was another question that I got a lot this past summer. Do you think that what happened during the summer with the Black Lives Matter movement is going to translate to the vote and the ballot and the polls? And my response was always absolutely. I had a conviction and a belief that we had the power to change the world. We had the power to rewrite history, and we had the power to say something. And for me, it was really important to show that even in the midst of what others would define as chaos, there was an opportunity to take a stand for something. And so when I think about my very early childhood, right, and always kind of being labeled as mischievous and all of that, and now being able to take my mischievous nature to the front lines, I think of the importance of not stifling, right, that inner child, not stifling that inner creativity, not stifling that ability to think outside of the box, because it is ultimately the boxes that we think within that oftentimes confine us. And so something to just leave you all with. I also have a deck that I'm going to try to share if Zoom will cooperate with me to show you all some images that I have from this past summer and how it really just connects and translates to the earlier stage of the movement. So can you all see this? Just confirming that we're good with the image?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So this is a picture of me actually at the March on Washington, and it was extremely hot. I will say that it was extremely, extremely hot because of COVID-19 restrictions. There wasn't any food or anything like that that was at the march. And so it was literally us, our masks, and heat. And that was a lot. And so this image is actually from one of Martin Luther King's marches, but also the March on Washington that he spoke at, which also was the same march that John Lewis spoke at. And John Lewis was also 23 years old when he spoke at the March on Washington, which was the same age that I was. And so John Lewis, as we all know, left us in 2020 at the height of the protests that were taking place. And that was one of the most difficult things for the movement at the time, especially in New York, because of the legacy that he was leaving behind, but also giving to us, right? And so it felt in a lot of ways of a passing of the torch. Whether or not we were mentally ready to receive it was something different altogether. And so here are also some images from the day of the March on Washington, 1963 and 2020. So the folks behind, well, this is actually me in the left-hand corner. The folks next to me are Freedom March, our different organizers, lead organizers, folks who've been on the ground, supporters, etc. And then above the image is the 1963 version of the March on Washington, where you'll actually see John Lewis. And I don't even think that MLK is in this picture, but it's just a powerful picture in general. And then over to the right side is what the March on Washington looked like in 1963 versus what it looked like in 2020. And the biggest difference is the fact that we were in a pandemic. And so what I will say about this is that this is also a testament to the power of what the racial justice movement has evolved into, but in a lot of ways, what it means, and how even in the midst of a pandemic, folks still came out, right? They still showed up. And there is so much power in that. And what I will also add to that point is that showing up doesn't just mean in person, right? Because we also have to recognize the fact that it was a privilege to be there that day, because there are folks who, because of COVID-19, cannot leave their house because they are more at risk, right, of the fatalities of COVID-19. There are folks out who aren't in this picture because of financial insecurity and the inability to even get to DC that day, right? That's another very real reality. When we talk about activism and organizing, let's also keep in mind that there are folks who lost their lives this summer to this work. Toyin, she was a Nigerian, I believe first generation immigrant, first generation American, her family from Nigeria, who was a Black woman on the front lines in Florida. She was abducted, she was assaulted, and she was killed. She was an organizer. There are so many organizers who I can think of in New York who remind me of Toyin, who are my sisters on the front lines, who are folks who perhaps are a part of a different organizing group that we have put in the blood, sweat, and tears. And it was so hurtful to hear what happened to Toyin, because when you think about where funding went this past summer, when you think about how difficult it is to sustainably be able to do this work, when you think about what has happened to our civil rights leaders, such as Martin Luther King, such as MLK, right, such as Fred Hampton, when you think about the ways in which they left us, the ways in which they were executed, the ways in which they were targeted, the ways in which they weren't supported while they were alive, right? And so the implications of that, even present day, particularly as a Black woman on the front lines, and how not only are you dealing with gender, but also race and the intersections of that. So just something to keep in mind. And so in a lot of ways, I call 2020 the year of Black women showing up for others, but also the ways in which we called others to step up and show up for us as well. And then I added this slide as the last slide, just because I love this picture, even though I'm not even the one on the mic. I just love this picture in general. This is actually a member of another organizing group in New York. This was one of our events, but he was asked to speak. And that Strategy for Black Lives, a separate organizing collective that was also birthed out of the George Floyd protest. But what I love about this was that there were actually two separate marches that were happening, and they intersected. And it was the Black Trans Liberation March, in addition to our march where we were demanding the resignation of the NYPD commissioner. And on this day, it was the solidarity piece, but also showing how much our movement has grown and how much our movement has created space for those who oftentimes have been left out of the conversations to be a part of those conversations. And so you can't talk about LGBTQ rights without talking about Marsha P. Johnson, who was a Black woman, right? And so in that same way, you can't talk about the civil rights without talking about all of the incredible Black women who carried the torch of that. And so to me, this image is just powerful to see and to understand. And also you can see the different colors of folks in this picture, which also is a testament to the importance of our allies who showed up this past summer and contributed to the work and still contribute to the work. And we will continue to keep them to task that they contribute to the work. But yeah, so that is my last slide. And I don't want to go too over because I know that it's 5:30 on the dot, which is wild because there's a lot more that I could say, but I will close it here because I know we have our panel and I'm excited to answer any questions and talk about, you know, what's next. And I know this is a part of one of a 3-part series. So thank you.
No, thank you so much for this. You are simply amazing. I don't know about anybody else, but I can say that you just gave us the tools to remind us that it's our talents and our resources that can transition us from being just impressive to impactful. And I love that you even reminded us that we can be effective anywhere, especially being in a pandemic, like even within your own community. So I do have the pleasure to also introduce the panelists. We have Bryce Winston, Tashira Shepard, and Calvin Lewis. So you guys want to go ahead and dive into our Q&A discussion.
Hey, Chelsea. So question for you from me is that what made you decide to get into, let me rephrase that. What made you decide to become an activist? Like what kind of like sparked your idea and was like, hey, I need to be out there and do something about this? Like what made you?
That's a funny question. Okay, I'll answer this question because in fact, before this summer, I was conflicted about whether or not I wanted to call myself an activist just because I felt as though it puts you in a box. And for me, I've always been one to defy all boxes and just do my own thing in the world. And really what I consider myself to be before the summer was a social entrepreneur. And so for me, it was really important to think about how do we look at our society, right, in our world, in our communities, and how do we create sustainable organizations, sustainable businesses, the sustainable platforms ultimately to be able to do the work long term. Because I would look at history and I would see, you know, that from an activist standpoint, oftentimes the infrastructure wasn't in place to create that long-term change. And so how could I take, right, my learnings, if you will, from these different experiences that I've had and do that? And so before Freedom March NYC, in college, I actually founded Women at Ripley, which is a national leadership pipeline for women and girls of color. Through that work, we worked with Trana Burke, creator of the Me Too movement, training women and girls, developing their leadership skills, working with the Department of Education on programming for young girls, that by the time 2020 came, we actually had expanded to 8 states and 20 plus universities and had a chapter in India doing that work. And so that's what I was doing in addition to like helping other businesses and nonprofits think about how to scale their brands and their work. And so when the title of activist descended upon me, I had to embrace it because the truth was that in the discourse, there needed to be a space carved out for that. And more people needed to understand and see, right, the ability to see that there is not one way to be an activist and there is not one way to define what it looks like to take up space in this movement. You know, I'm someone who has worked in so many different spaces, from working in the Obama White House to working in fashion and starting my own clothing brand 2 years ago, to then working in corporate America on social impact strategy. I've literally done it all, right? And so it was just so important to me to be able to say, you know what, if you're going to call me an activist, it's always going to have to be an and. And I think that there's power in that, and especially as a Black woman, to be able to take a title, but also redefine it. And so that's what I've been doing ever since. And I think that's why so many folks gravitated towards Freedom March NYC and the movement, and the fact that, okay, it's two Black women who are spearheading this organization and inspiring so many people and doing so unapologetically, right? And so all of that was important in the shaping of the work that we did, the policy that we would create, mutual aid funds that we would ultimately be able to share with other organizers within our communities, and, organizing for Louisville and Breonna Taylor and all of that has come from an understanding of self, the work, and how our identity plays a part in that.
I am so sorry. I got excited to dive into this conversation. Can our panelists introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about yourself for Ms. Chelsea Miller before we dive further into our conversation?
Sorry about that. My name is Bryce Winston, and I am originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but I reside in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm a senior at Albany State University, major in computer science with a mathematics concentration. And I served for Aaliyah Johnson in her Johnson administration for SGA. And I am also part of a national service fraternity, Alpha Phi Omega. And that's a bit about me.
I will go next. My name is Tashir Shepard. I am a senior here at Albany State. I'm a biology major. I'm originally from Augusta, Georgia, and I do a lot. I'm involved in quite a few organizations, and that's pretty much about me.
To be in college again.
Hey, I'm Calvin. I'm a senior at Albany State from Jacksonville, Florida. I play on the school's football team. I'm a spring 20 initiate of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated.
Hey, Cam.
Hey.
Very cool. And I'm a spring 18 initiate of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. So it's a good day to be an AKA. Well, it's always a good day to be an AKA, but yesterday made that all the more special. I'm sure you can't have a conversation with an AKA without us mentioning Kamala Harris, at least maybe for the next 4 years, but yeah. Is that everyone, or is there someone else who's going to introduce themselves?
I think that's everyone. I can actually ask a question for you. So many of us are dependent upon social media to discover and learn what's occurring in our communities. What are some other avenues for discovery?
It's a really good question. You're actually the second person who was asking that question today. The first one was Billie Eilish's mom, because I actually did a live with her. So the answer to this question is, in addition to social media, which I think can definitely be a tool of communication, building community, and also amplifying your message. But I also think that there should be an intentionality in where you find your sources, and that's across the board anywhere. And I would also say that in 2016, what we saw actually was one of the largest disinformation campaigns, particularly targeted at Black and Latinx voters leading up to the elections. And so there were bots that were created, right, as a way to deter folks from going to the polls. And this is something that we will continue to see as social media grows, and also as more generations who are coming up haven't necessarily experienced the world without social media. And so it is really important to be intentional about sources. One of the biggest things that I always say is that just because it's viral doesn't make it true. And that's just the reality, right? Just because someone has a large platform doesn't mean they know what they're talking about. And so being intentional about, always fact checking, always making sure that you are following accounts that are valid, and I'm not necessarily saying verified, but valid in what they are saying, and feel like they have some type of responsibility to share information that is true and honest. I will also add that, like everything, even in school, when you learn about, primary sources and secondary sources. In that same way, when someone is sharing information with you, understand that there is a who, what, where, when, and why type of thing, right? Everyone has an investment in the information that they put out into the world. The question is whether or not that investment is for their own self-interest or to benefit the community at large. And so be intentional. And if it is to benefit the community at large, then the question of which community are they trying to ultimately benefit from this, right? What is the vantage point in which they see the world? And does this align with my own vantage point? And if it doesn't align with my own vantage point, how does it challenge that? And so these are some of the questions that we have to ask ourselves. I would also add that one of the really good documentaries that I watched recently, and I would recommend folks checking out, is called The Social Dilemma on Netflix. And it talks about the fact that even social media as this huge tool to disseminate information can also oftentimes be a detriment to our own ability to understand the other side. And I think this also ties into the lovely, cast by Isabel Wilkerson that I really enjoyed unpacking. And really just kind of talking about the ways in which we exist in these bubbles, right? And so social media can oftentimes be that bubble. And so I would say once every few days, I challenge myself to step into the other side of the social media spectrum and see, what folks on the other side are talking about. And so I actually did that this morning when everyone's talking about the inauguration. I was like, okay, great. Yep, did my CNN check. Yep, we're aligned. This is great. Okay. Tamika Mallory said this. Okay, boom, said that. Great. And then I went to the other side of social media to okay, what is conservative America thinking right now? And of course, it was everything that I wasn't. But at the same time, it's important to understand the other side. That's really, especially because I do a lot of interviews with CNN. I do a lot of interviews with, different platforms, Politico, et cetera. And so it's always really important for me to have a base to which I understand, but also what is the conversation that's happening that I'm not privy to? And how can I speak to, all of these different pieces and elements that ultimately are driving the discourse and what will happen next? So all of that to say, I have a lot of thoughts on that, but do your research, be intentional, and follow trustworthy sources, and check your family members who may put false information in the family group chats and let them know that is false. Yes.
Awesome. I really love that. So since we're already on the topic of doing more research and trying to do more, I know earlier you mentioned that there's a lot that can be done and that you can be an activist within any aspect. So for those who are introverts and they're behind the scene, how can they become more active and involved?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I would say knowing your talents. So there's this really good story that I tell all the time that happened. It was about week 2 of us being on the front lines where, we were at that point trying to figure out who had megaphones. We were trying to figure out, okay, what is going to be the strategy when we get on the ground? How can we make sure that we're maximizing our voices, saving our energy, et cetera? And there was this one white ally who actually saw the fact that so many organizers in New York were losing their voices because they didn't have megaphones that were top tier in the market, right? That could help them with straining their voice. Because mind you, at this point, it was basically every day being on the ground, marching. It was hot. It was a lot, right? And so this person, right, who most of us had never met before but had marched with us, actually organized a GoFundMe to raise money to get all of the organizers in New York megaphones. And within 24, 48 hours, every organizer in New York had megaphones. There was this other story that I tell a lot of. It was about day 3 of us being on the ground. And it was this South Asian ally who was like, okay, I see Freedom March NYC is out here posting flyers, but you guys need a website. You guys need a website because people need to know where to go to find out information about what you all are doing, how you're mobilizing, and to learn more about the Freedom March story so that they can get involved. And we didn't have time to build a website. We were like, we gotta go. We gotta go on the streets. We don't have time for this. We need to go pull up to, 42nd Street or demand this person's resignation. We don't have time. We can't do this. And the person was like, okay, just send me everything that you possibly have and I'll build the website for you. Within 48 hours, we had a website. And we were one of the first organizations that had developed out of the George Floyd protests and organizing collectives in New York to have a website. And that website, I can maybe count how many times I've actually gone to it. But what I will say about it is that for other people, it's really important to see those fundamental things in place as a way to understand what is their mission, how can we support them, etc. Within a few weeks of us having a website and our GoFundMe, we had raised over $50,000 for Freedom March NYC. We had received, right, like all of these different like support systems that were in place to support the work. And so for me, when I mean supporting the movement, I think of it through the lens of whether or not you are a graphic designer, which we've also had graphic designers through this past summer that we've leaned on to design flyers because we haven't had time. And we've had folks who have built platforms like Justice for George NYC. And it's this huge platform with over 250,000 followers, right? That has amplified flyers for so many different organizers on the ground. And so in that same way, I think it really is about just finding what fits you and what makes the most sense for you as far as how you understand your impact, and to do that and then do that sustainably and do that in a way that prioritizes your own mental health and your own self-care, because activism organizing is definitely draining. This work is draining, but at the same time, you know, it is so important to do. And so I would say getting into a sustainable rhythm of doing social justice work and creating impact that feels authentic to you.
I have a question for you. So I know you mentioned that you got your movement started in college. So my question for you is, what are some steps that us as students here at Albany State can take to become more socially active, you know, for the ones that are really, really interested in becoming socially active, whether they're extroverts or introverts?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I would say, honestly, I have been doing, like, even before college, I remember I was in high school and I had traveled to Burma, which is in Southeast Asia. I was 16 at the time, for about 10 days to go and like learn about global women's rights and, you know, how does what's happening in the US connect to what's happening in Burma, because Burma is also a democratic society, etc. My parents were like, you're not going to Burma, but I got on the flight and I went. So I think that that's just something that's always been very innate to me of doing and also being curious. And so I would say the biggest thing is to always try to put yourself in position to learn, grow, and understand. I think that it's because of my ability to kind of really understand so many different perspectives and to be able to really kind of reconcile all of that, that has helped me and shaped my activism. And so I would definitely say that that's something that folks should consider. And then I would also say to learn from the folks who have come before. I don't necessarily think that you need to have a mentor who is an activist. That's not what I mean. But I think more so being able to put yourself in spaces where you are able to see, right, firsthand how some of the things that you're passionate about looks like. You know, how does it work? What are different mechanisms that folks have used in the past that perhaps you can either replicate or you can ideate from? And so for me, it was really important to always do that. I actually worked with the NAACP. I was the NAACP vice president during my time at Columbia for about 2 years, through my work, right, with like Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, understanding the history of the sorority and how that's come to be. So a lot of different work that I've done even before that. During high school, I actually started a girls mentorship program in my community. And the principal gave me like 10 girls for a summer. And I designed a curriculum talking about civic engagement, self-esteem, you name it. And it was incredible, right? And so that was actually one of the early stages of me developing my leadership pipeline for men and girls of color, was because of that experience of the work that I did in my community. And it was through my work that I did on campus and with my community that ultimately led to me being a part of the final intern class for the Obama administration, working on criminal justice reform, but also touching all of the things that very much so connect to the work that I was doing already on campus as a political science major and work with NAACP, et cetera. So everything connects is my advice that I would give to folks. Everything connects, and don't be afraid to really just continue to learn and grow and put yourself in spaces to do that. After college, I ended up spending some time working in corporate America on social impact strategy for no other reason besides I was first fed up after 2016, after being in the White House that day, but also because of the fact that I wanted to learn and have a firsthand understanding of what social impact looked like, not just from the public sector side, but also the private sector, and what was the work that was being done? What is the language that folks speak? And now, no longer being in corporate America, that helps me speak the language when necessary when it comes to thinking about how do we continue to grow our work? How do we continue to push folks to do better, right? And so whether that be the consulting that I do with brands and companies, whether that be calling out brands and companies, whether that be, really putting people to task, it looks different across the board.
You're awesome. Thank you so much. Calvin, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. So you said in 2016, you were somewhat fed up with your efforts or the results or whatever. What was one of the factors that made you keep going instead of, when you got out of college, you worked for a while, and obviously if you're working, you had to take some time off from your passion. What made you, just keep going and not, abandon what you were intrigued by?
Yeah, that's actually funny because
Ms. Miller, before you answer that, because we're running out of time, and so I definitely want you to answer that, and then the president has a couple words. But let me just briefly share. I'm so excited about the questions that are being posed to Ms. Miller, and we are elated that she will be back for a part 2 where she, in February, organizing the digital, during the digital age. And then also in March, she'll come back and discuss how to engage on campus, and then she'll be participating in our campus read. And so if you could give us a brief answer to Mr. Lewis's answer, and then the president has some closing remarks.
Yes. Brief answer to that is I actually never stopped. I'm always doing many things at once. I wear multiple hats. And so I was still working on, we believe, my national leadership pipeline while also working at the company, and in fact left the company to work full time with my organization, We Believe. It was just a matter of timing and feeling as though the organization needed to be in a place to sustainably, from an organizational infrastructure standpoint and budget, right, support what a full-time transition would look like, but still did the work. And then I would say to that point of feeling frustrated, there's times where you feel frustrated, there's times where you feel tired and like you need to rest. But one of the things that I always say, and this is something that I set the March on Washington too, is that we rest on the shoulders of giants, right? And so you rest today, you get to the work tomorrow. So that is my short answer, and I will talk about it more in February.
All right, are we sure we have to end? Ms. Miller, thank you so much. And so I hate that we are wrapping up. This was very good, very enlightening for me, actually. We had a couple of questions in the chat, and one I do want to bring up is from one of our wonderful faculty members, Dr. Mons, and Dr. Mons may ask the question that I'm curious about how the energy that exudes in urban areas can permeate in rural towns. She's a transplant from Detroit, Michigan, and she came to Albany. She also has, and I keep this book on my desk if Dr. Mons is looking, it's the Center for Educational Opportunity, where she's actually working with fragile communities and bring them kind of out of that from an education standpoint. So doing some great work, but I would love to hear feedback before we wrap up on that topic, and then I will wrap up. But how does that energy, those pictures you showed on your presentation, I'm from Philadelphia as well, Mr. Winston, grew up there in North Philly. And there was always activism. There was always activism in our home, so there was, we grew up with that and around that. And it does seem to be different when you're in a in an urban area and you're in a rural area. Give us a little feedback on that.
Yeah, so that's really interesting because I remember there were points this summer when we were organizing where folks were actually flying in to New York because they had heard about our protests and were coming to be a part of it, right? And so for me, when I think about this question, I think that it's twofold. I think that there's one piece of it where the energy, I think because of the ways in which social media has really amplified, right, an understanding of how communities are speaking the same language in a lot of ways, that it creates those opportunities for us to be able to mobilize and organize. So for instance, we use social media as a way to launch our digital trainings, Freedom March NYC, where we were actually training folks in rural areas this past summer to organize. I would say that organizing can look different though, right? Perhaps in a rural area, instead of organizing a march to City Hall, it looks like organizing a phone bank and partnering with a church on that, right? And so I think that depending on your demographic, depending on what exactly are the goals that you are trying to achieve, that it will look different and stakeholders will look different. And ultimately, the vehicles that you use to create the change will look different, right? Whereas in urban areas, because of the nature of, right, like population density, we post a flyer, we know folks will come. But perhaps in an urban area, there's another central place for folks to come together, right, and build community. Perhaps it is the church, perhaps it is the after school center, perhaps it is, a community collective, right? It looks different across the board. And so I think that it's important to leverage existing institutions. I think it's important to leverage existing relationships. And the last thing that I would say is that urgency is so important, right? A lot of times folks don't feel the urgency of what is taking place. And so it's really important, even from a communication standpoint, right? Like we go through so many versions of flyers trying to figure out, what are we going to say? How are we going to get people excited? How are we going to get people to show up? And so I would say it's an art being able to keep folks engaged, and it's an art in order to keep folks a part of the movement. And so really trying to figure out who your demographic is, how you're speaking to them to ultimately bring people together is important. And that sounds like a good thing to tackle in the digital organizing class. See how I did that?
Absolutely. Right in there. Thank you for that. So President Johnson, thank you as always for your facilitation. You are always great with bringing us together and getting topics up there. So President Johnson, thank you so much for that. I am honored to be celebrating the incomparable legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. I want to say a couple of things before I go into just closing us out. Ms. Miller talked about responsibility. I was taking notes because y'all know I'm gonna come back at you with it, right? But I was taking notes. She talked about responsibility. She talked about the actions that she took in the summer that actually reflected the message that she wanted to have come out there. I think it's interesting that you actually you grappled a little bit with having that title of activist, which you are, and all those other things, absolutely. And I want to encourage our students and others who are on the line. You can be an activist, but one of the things she talked about was the purpose and why you're doing it and what's the next step, what's the strategy. I always talk about strategy because I think it's so important. If you all recall, in the summer, we also had Mr. Cousins, who was a football player along with Mr. Lewis there, who actually just came to my office and asked one day, I want to do this. And he wanted to do some things around activism. And as long as we're doing that the right way, right, you have a purpose. You know what's next, or at least you're thinking about what's next. I say that to the SGA. Yes, we can do that, but then what does that lead to? Why are we doing it? What are we doing it for? Who are we trying to touch? Who are we trying to get in contact with? Let your voices be heard. There was a question that disappeared, couldn't find that question, but it asked about advocacy. It asked about how do you do policy? What is that about? How do we think about that? that is something I will absolutely bring someone to this campus to help you with. We have faculty that can actually help you with that as well. If there's something that doesn't look right, that you want to see change, or this right, but you want to enhance it, I encourage our students to work with our faculty, to work with our centers that we have up right now, our diversity, inclusion, and social equity centers, to actually bring that to our attention. I also agree that again, I grew up in Philadelphia, then moved to to Augusta, totally different environments, completely different environments, and not as much activism in Augusta. But guess what? These areas are the areas that have the most reason to actually be activists, because there are so many things that we can do better in our rural areas, in our areas that are not the big city areas. Improvements are needed there, but they are definitely needed here as well. So I encourage you all, as you're thinking about that, talk to your faculty members, those professors who are interested in doing the same things, and let's see what we can do. I want y'all to stay on top of that. Ms. Miller, you were invited to be our guest speaker and kind of kick this off. You are outstanding. I am so proud of what you're doing. Please keep doing that and all the other things that you have going on. So as evidenced moments ago, Ms. Miller, your words definitely reflect Dr. King and his lessons. So thank you for that. Yesterday, yes, at the inauguration, there were a lot of great speakers, but I'll tell you, gentlemen, no offense, but all of our women on that stage showed up and showed out, shouting all over. You know, if y'all heard it coming from Daisy Brown, it was just me. Don't worry about it. But it was so exciting to see that happen. And I know we'll continue to do that. And our gentlemen on the call, you all are going to be participating in that as well. So on behalf of our students, faculty, and staff at Albany State, thank you for your presence, Ms. Miller. We know this is only part one. You're unapologetic about what you're doing. And I think that is also important. I ask every single one of you to be the same way. When you want your voice to be heard, make your voice heard. And I'm delighted in those remarks. So we're going to actually discuss, we have the Common Read that we're kicking off through our center. And February's Common Read will be on cast by Isabel Wilkerson. And our newly formed Centers of Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Equity will host this 4-part series. So this is part one of a 4-part series. So you'll see more information that's going to come out about that. Please engage, please be a part of it. Again, please tell us what you want to know. Dr. Wilson is actually managing that for us. And you all know how to get in touch with Dr. Wilson. If not, Ms. Shavers can help you with that as well. So that if y'all have questions or any of that stuff, that you can actually do it. So to our many viewers, continue to be safe and well. Thank you for joining us for 2021 for our first celebration, our Dr. Martin Luther King celebration. And without any other questions, I want y'all to have a great evening. Be safe, and please stay out of trouble. But I appreciate y'all so much. Have a great night.